Supreme Court Justice Samuel Alito came out during a recent-ish Wall Street Journal interview and said that he doesn't believe Congress has the authority to impose upon the Supreme Court an ethics code. And now we have his counterpart, his colleague, Supreme Court Justice Elena Kagan, saying the opposite, contradicting Justice Alito, which is good to see because I am on board with and I want an ethics code to be applied to, mandated on the Supreme Court and the Supreme Court justices. It is strange that when you look at federal judges, other individuals serving as a judge within the federal judiciary, they have all these regulations and guidelines that they're forced to abide by. But then you look at the most important position within the federal judiciary, a Supreme Court justice, and they don't have that. Completely inappropriate. And now we've seen what that is able to lead to with the recent scandals involving actually multiple Supreme Court justices, the most stark and well covered being the Clarence Thomas related ones, with the lavish gifts and trips he's received from GOP mega donor Harlan Crow and all of the conflicts of interest that can cause. And so with that context in mind, there's now a discussion among Senate Democrats of trying to impose an ethics code of conduct onto the Supreme Court. And before we get to the clip that's recent from Elena Kagan, first, kind of what she's responding to. This is from the Wall Street Journal. Justice Alito says he voluntarily follows disclosure statutes that apply to lower court judges and executive branch officials. So do the other justices. Not really. But he notes that Congress did not create the Supreme Court. The Constitution did. I know this is a controversial view, Alito says, but I'm willing to say it. No provision in the Constitution gives them the authority to regulate the Supreme Court, period. But as Newsweek notes, the fallacy in his argument is his failure to consider the history following the adoption of our Constitution. Over the years since our founding, Congress has in fact regulated the Supreme Court in numerous ways already. It has changed the number of justices, their salary, and the location and premises of the High Court. And of course, it may impeach a justice if it finds that he or she committed treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. Although the Constitution lays out the mandatory jurisdiction of the Supreme Court, Congress has played a role in regulating even that important aspect of the Supreme Court's work. So that gives you a sense of Alito's argument, in my mind, doesn't hold water. And Supreme Court Justice Elena Kagan seems to agree. This is from Axios. Quote, "We are not imperial." Supreme Court Justice reveals support for new ethics code. Recent revelations about lavish gifts and the justices' business activities have brought fresh scrutiny to the High Court's lack of a formal code of ethics. The Supreme Court is the only court in the federal judiciary that doesn't have an official ethics code. Quote, "It just can't be that the court is the only institution that somehow is not subject to checks and balances from anybody else. We're not imperial," Kagan said at a judicial conference in Portland, Oregon on Thursday, Politico reported. And so with that in mind, we will take a look at this moment from Elena Kagan.
The first is, of course, Congress can regulate various aspects of what the Supreme Court does. I mean, Congress funds the Supreme Court. Congress historically has made changes to the court's structure and composition. Congress historically has made changes to the court's appellate jurisdiction. And indeed, there's a provision in the Constitution that says something like the Supreme Court shall have appellate jurisdiction under regulations that Congress provides, or as, you know, I'm missing the exact words, but it actually talks about Congress having a role in our jurisdiction. It talks about Congress regulating the jurisdiction at the Supreme Court. And I think, you know, more generally, this is like not surprising. I mean, our whole system is one of checks and balances. And usually when the court talks about that, we're talking about other actors and the way they check and balance each other, or the way we check and balance them. But it just can't be that the court is the only institution that somehow is not subject to any checks and balances from anybody else. I mean, we're not imperial, and we too are a part of a checking and balancing system in various ways.
And she does go on to outline what the opposite argument would be, but seems to support what she just laid out there. And it really does make sense. Why in this form of government that lays out so many checks and balances would the Supreme Court be the only institution not subjected to that? Of course they're subjected. The only question is, does that include Congress mandating something like an ethics code of conduct onto the Supreme Court? And I would argue yes. And I think even in the interest of the Supreme Court justices, if they care about their perception of legitimacy among the American population, it would be good for them to have something like that, what other federal judges are subjected to, what other judges generally are subjected to, so that in a moment where we're having an issue with that perception of legitimacy among the American people, when they look at the Supreme Court, one of the ways we can address that is to up the bar, make the standards. I think they should be the highest if you're a Supreme Court justice, that you have to follow the highest, most strict rules and regulations, and make sure you're acting as ethically as possible and transparently as possible. But at least bring it up to what other judges have to do, so that at least in one way, when it comes to the ethical decisions being made and the possible conflicts of interest, the American people have more hope in, belief in, trust in the Supreme Court and Supreme Court justices. So to me, what Democrats are pushing forward, we've looked at Sheldon Whitehouse explaining why legislation like what they're pushing for would be really good, is something that should be uncontroversial and broadly supported. But for some reason right now, Republicans don't seem super excited about it. But good for Supreme Court Justice Elena Kagan for breaking with her colleague and supporting this type of action. Thank you so much for watching. If you want to be a part of what makes this show possible, plus get access to the full video version of the show hours before all the clips are able to be uploaded to the YouTube channel, plus get the bonus show on the weekends, you can do so by going to lukebeasleyshow.com/membership. That's lukebeasleyshow.com/membership, and there's a link in the description.